Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of our continuing educational series, Hurricane U. Very, very honored to speak with a guy that I didn't even know existed. I'll be honest about it until Don Moe said, "Oh yeah, Hal Needham's coming by with some stuff for whatever it was," and I think 2019. It might have been for Barry, and I was like, "Hal Needham? I didn't know there's anybody named Hal Needham putting stuff out, but there is." And this guy knows a lot about storm surge. And that, my friends, is what we're going to talk about tonight. I didn't know much about Hal Needham until 2019 and beyond. Hal, welcome. Tell us a bit of who you are. Who is Hal Needham? Dr. Hal Needham, I want to add to that.
Mark, it's a pleasure. You're bringing back memories there of Don Moe and Sycamore Point. I actually tried to ride Barry out at Sycamore Point, and the police just said, we can absolutely not let you do that. I was looking at tide levels, and you know that area down there in South Central Louisiana gets a very, very efficient storm surge producing in that part of the country. But a pleasure to be here on Hurricane U and join you today. I'm Dr. Hal Needham. I'm an extreme weather and disaster scientist with the GeoTrack project, and my passion is hurricanes, storm surge, and coastal flooding specifically, and in recent years, a lot more science education as well.
Very much needed. So do you have an origin story? Like, what got you into weather? Would you say that were you born and raised down there? You're in Galveston, Texas. We need to geolocate you.
Yeah, that's right.
There.
Yeah,
And
I'm
so,
living in Galveston, Texas. I live in the debris field of the 1900 storm. So this is the deadliest disaster in U.S. history. Happened right in my neighborhood back in September of 1900. I did not grow up along the Gulf Coast. I actually grew up in the East Coast, the Northeast, where blizzards and nor'easters were the big thing. But I was fascinated by weather from the time I was about 4 years old. The big event of my childhood was a blizzard in February of 1983. I was about 8 years old. And actually it snowed in the meteorology textbooks. It talks about usually on the coastal plain there, you don't get heavy snow. They got 5 inches of snow in 1 hour in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where I was from, about 26 inches for that storm. And at that point, I was already interested in weather, but then I became interested in anything related to extreme weather after some of those big snowstorms up there.
Yeah, everybody seems that's in the business has some kind of an event that shaped their lives, that got them interested in weather. And for me, most people know my story. It's Eastern North Carolina, the hurricanes of the 50s. I heard about the graveyard of the Atlantic, but I also grew up learning about Hurricane Camille and that famous documentary put out by Civil Defense, A Lady Called Camille. I would see it at the North Carolina Aquarium. A lot of storm surge video in there. Some of it was Hollywoodized, I think. No special effects to speak of back in '69, at least not in documentaries anyway. But it was nightmarish. You know, it was that old style, the narration, the music and the string instruments, and even the narration, as I said, and the different people that were in it. And that really helped to sort of, it made hurricanes feel legendary to me. And I thought, I'm going to study those one day. I don't know how. It's a little kid, right? I don't know how, but I'm going to do it. And now all these decades later, that's exactly what I've done. My specialty has really been storm surge. And that's what we're going to talk about. And that's the crux of all of this, is the number one potential killer. Now, it sounds obvious, but let's just make sure people understand, okay, why would storm surge kill me?
Yeah, for sure. You know, a lot of people, when they think of hurricanes, they're thinking of wind events. I think part of that is because a lot of the media footage you see is palm trees blowing around in the wind. It's a lot easier to film a palm tree blowing around than to film a 15-foot storm surge racing onto the coast and destroying everything in its path. It's hard to film something like that and survive, right? So storm surge is really this wall of water. Some people describe it as a dome of water that pushes on shore during a hurricane landfall. Not to be confused with a tsunami. So we see footage of tsunamis that are usually earthquake generated, where there'll be a series of huge waves. With storm surge, it's really a dome of water. If you're looking at storm surge video, a lot of times you're seeing palm trees or houses that are in 8 or 10 feet of water, and you're seeing a lot of really small waves moving rapidly. It's flowing quickly. It almost looks like a class 5 rapid river kind of thing. It's often flowing very fast, and it's so destructive. Just think of how heavy water is. If you're trying to carry a gallon of water up 3 flights of stairs, it gets heavy. That's just one gallon.
7 or 8 pounds per gallon, right?
These
seawater is worse.
Surges, it's trillions of gallons of water pounding the coast. with fast flowing water, and then a lot of times big waves on top of that that are just
Right.
blasting into these buildings. So a lot of buildings just completely destroyed. In the worst case scenario, people come back to a home, they're expecting to see a palm tree on their house, and there's actually no house at all. It's just a
That's a slab.
slab of concrete.
All right. So why is Dr. Hal Needham an expert in storm surge? Because I've learned over the years after Don Moe, mentioned your name, and I had to look in, oh, who is Hal Needham? And everybody knew who you were. I was like, how has this guy been such a secret during my career? But you, as I've learned, have done a lot with storm surge. And because it is still, despite our best efforts, and those efforts have paid off, let's not get lost in that, but it is still the most potential deadliest of the hazards. So what have you done over your career? How did you become so enthralled by storm surge? And what are some of the works you've done related to it?
Yeah, for sure.
Projects.
To start it off, how I got into surge, it's a bit of a strange story. I actually, grew up in the Northeast. I was really into winter sports, and that took me to Alaska. I
Mm-hmm.
actually got involved in extreme weather science work in Alaska, and I was doing work out there on the Bering Strait on the border of Alaska and Russia. And there was a Canadian scientist on one of these projects who, this was right about the time of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and then
Right.
Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005. This Canadian scientist I was working with, he said, man, if I was a young professional getting into climate science, I'd get into coastal flooding and storm surge. And I said, why? He said, look at these big events, these huge, $100+ billion events like Katrina. There's going to be a lot of funding with this. And I never thought in those terms as a young professional. A few years later, I was moving to the Gulf Coast. I did a master's and doctorate at Louisiana State University, and it was really funding to study anything in extreme climate. And I thought, I'm moving to South Louisiana, and this conversation with this scientist about get into something that's high impact, that'll have a lot of funding attached to it. And I thought, here I am in South Louisiana, 3 years after Hurricane Katrina. Why don't I
Right.
look into studying storm surge climatology? Where do these surges happen? How big are they? How often do they happen? If you take a city like Houston or Galveston or Miami or New Orleans, how frequently do they get inundated at a certain level? These what we call return periods. So
Yeah.
became interested in this and started looking into it. And as I started building some data sets, Mark, it was probably 4 or 5 months into that research that one day I realized, wait, there's no database for storm surges in the U.S. This is the most deadly destructive hazard on the planet. I
Sure.
was like, you got to be kidding me. There's no database. And so this started this passion where I realized there was no database for the deadliest, most destructive hazard. And I quickly realized why. I found storm surge data everywhere. Just in my master's degree from 2008 to 2010, I found data in 62 different sources, including 3,000 pages of historical newspaper, just tons of information about past events, but it was all scattered and
Yeah.
needed really to be brought into one place. So really, that started work that I did for my master's and doctorate. I created a storm surge data set called SurgeDat during my grad school, and then I've continued to build this, improve it, expand it, and it actually became really the U.S. storm surge database. And then I also built the first storm surge database for the Philippines, for Australia, for
Oh,
India,
yeah.
Bangladesh. All of these are only tropical cyclone generated storm
Right.
surges. So
Right.
if there's a big surge in Eastern Canada in January, it's not in my
Right.
database. But I've been building this now for 16 years. The database is called USurge, and it's just something that I continue to build. But really, the passion is, think about a hot day in July where they say this is a record high temperature for St.
Right.
Louis, because we have air temperature data for a lot of our cities
Yeah.
going back 120, 140 years. My
Sure.
passion with this and my vision was, why don't we have the same thing for storm surge? Why can't we say this is the third highest high water mark on record for Fort Myers? And that kind of thing really did not exist before this work of building this database.
That's incredible to think of because, surge, you think about the 1900 hurricane in Galveston, those deaths, that's primarily because of storm surge. I mean, it bulldozed a good deal of the city. And we know the power of water. We should anyway. I mean, water made the Grand Canyon, for goodness sakes. It took a while, but if it carved the Grand Canyon, it can certainly do a lot. So that sort of helps to set up, all right, Hal knows what he's talking about. So now let's look at storm surge because it's very important to understand the mechanics of it and sort of demystify it. Because as you said, Hollywood movies, and even some old documentaries sort of misrepresent it, not on purpose necessarily, but just because there hasn't been that much good storm surge video.
Yeah,
Some from the chasers of yesteryear, I think of the late great Jim Leonard as an example,
sure.
have filmed storm surges in Guam and some in the United States. But it really wasn't, to toot my own horn a little bit, until we started putting these cameras out on purpose to capture surge from the beginning to the end, especially in situations like Michael or Ida in recent years, and Ian even in Fort Myers. And now more people are doing it. We
Yeah.
think about what Max Olson has accomplished with, and that's great that it has grown. But we certainly have seen more storm surge video now, mostly through these remote cameras that my project has set up since really 20 years ago, but
Yeah.
really the last 5 years, because it's just become, there's been a lot of hurricanes.
Yeah.
But still, you see it, we got to understand the mechanics of it. And so let's just talk about that a little bit. First of all, and we can almost play a true or false and then kind of expand on it, that storm surge is mostly a function of the wind stress on the water. It pushes the water
Right.
towards the shore. So let's talk about that. Where does it mostly, the whole hurricane's blowing towards the shore if it's, aimed towards the coastline, but it's near that eye wall, right, where the surge can be the most violent. Why is that the case? Why isn't it just this wide sweeping thing like a tidal wave? Let's talk about the mechanics of it so people understand.
Yeah, for sure. No, I appreciate you bringing that up. And, it's interesting. It depends a lot on the size of the storm. When you get these storms with enormously geographically huge wind fields, like Hurricane Ike in 2008, people, Ike's an interesting story because a lot of people went to bed on a Thursday night and said, hey, Ike isn't making landfall till Friday night. Let's wake up Friday morning and see if it's still coming or if it's
Yeah.
going to turn. They wake up, and amazingly, 18 hours before landfall, the coastal roads are already under 4 or 5 feet of water. So
Right.
that's Ike was geographically enormous. Katrina, a lot of these storms were pushing water in a good 18 to 21 hours before landfall. Surge is already inundating the coastal roads. So these geographically huge storms, you just have this huge wind field, and a lot of these swells and a lot of the water is even outrunning the wind field. So
Right.
you can get it start to push in pretty early. But as you get closer, especially if you're in that front right quadrant, then you're really going to get these 120, 140 mile an hour winds just very efficiently pushing water towards shore. And it's
Right.
just really piling up. It's just that you have this strong onshore wind that's just piling the water up. It really does kind of look like a dome of water. The geographic size is important. Also, what I found in my doctorate, looking at the correlation between surge heights and winds at landfall and before landfall, I began to see as you move in time, the surge correlates much better with the pre-landfall winds than the winds at landfall. So you get a storm like Katrina, where it was a Cat 5 out in the Gulf, but it weakened to a Cat 3. And a lot of people in coastal Mississippi said, oh, this is fantastic. My house did not flood in Category 5 Camille in
Right.
1969. Katrina's a 3, so I'm good. All of a sudden, they're up to their necks in water. So
Yeah.
what's really interesting when you look at the pre-landfall winds, 18 hours before landfall, Katrina was only 11 knots weaker than Camille when you look at interpolated data sets.
Right.
So it was comparable to Camille, but so much geographically bigger. It makes sense that it pushed a lot more water towards the coast. So, I mean, really, I think it helps if people think of a hurricane as this broad wind field that's just pushing tons of water.
Yep.
And we can get into communication a little bit later in the broadcast, but a lot of times when we show a hurricane on the map, we show the little symbol at a point, and we
Sometimes
communicate
it's
the lat
turning.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
longitude. And
Right.
people start thinking of hurricanes as point features instead of broad wind fields. When you realize there's a massive wind field out there of hurricane force winds pushing water towards the shore, it starts to make sense why you would pile up a dome of water near the coast.
So when the Hurricane Center mentions tropical storm force winds extend out X miles from the center, hurricane force winds extend a certain amount of miles out from the center, that is important because that is that driving mechanism that's pushing the water towards the coast. So I think that we can all visualize that. If you had a kid's wading pool and you took a big old airboat fan or a leaf blower or whatever, you could blow that water to the opposite side of that pool. That is essentially storm surge. You're moving that water from one area to the other. And so there are differences, though, with what we call bathymetry, and so let's talk about that a little bit. We first know that it's mainly a function of the wind stressing on the water, pushing the water. But if the ocean is very deep just offshore versus very shallow, like the Mississippi Sound is shallow off of Northwest, in the Northwest Gulf is pretty shallow, then how you can get some very stark differences
You
in
can.
what happens. Same category, same type hurricane off of Hatteras versus one right off of High Island. You could have vastly different scenarios.
Mark, when I built USurge, the US Storm Surge database, I remember one day thinking, what a coincidence. How unlucky that that the number one and the number two surges in US history happened in the same town, past Christian, Mississippi. I thought, how unlucky, right? I mean, I really thought it was rolling the dice, and then as I got more into
Right.
it, I began to realize it's not really luck. You get to the Mississippi Sound, if you spent time there, you can walk offshore
Yeah.
100 yards and you're knee deep in water. It's incredibly shallow. So once that dome of water starts pushing in, if the water depth or the bathymetry is really shallow, you don't have enough volume of water to really redistribute these currents. It just,
Right.
it has,
It's
and
rising.
so with the bathymetry, it has nowhere to go but up. And
It
this
up.
is what happens in places like coastal Mississippi. And what's interesting, the models show if you move Katrina to the east 120 miles or so, the storm surge drops by about 12 feet. The same
Wow.
storm, the same wind field, the same profile. All that's really changed is your coastal water depth. And all of a sudden, instead of a 28-foot surge, you have a 16-foot surge. So the bathymetry is, I think that's the thing that surprises people the most, because when we stand on the beach and we look out at the water, we don't see what's going on
Yeah.
underneath the water.
Yeah.
To us, one water horizon looks the same
Yeah.
as the next, but what's going on underneath really changes the storm surge dynamics a lot.
Yeah. And you and I, we know we're standing there like when I'm in Rodanthe, North Carolina, or Kitty Hawk or whatever, I look to the east and I think, Hatteras Canyon's out there and you get some really big waves that come in. The wave energy is a lot more. You still get storm surge, of course, but it's a lot different than when I'm standing out in coastal Louisiana, gazing out across the Gulf or certainly the Mississippi Sound.
Sure.
Something like Katrina is coming. It's very easy to understand how you can drive 28 feet plus of Gulf of Mexico onshore. So we have the bathymetry, which is, again, like the underneath part of the water, the part that we
Yeah.
can't see. But what about the shape of the coastline?
Yeah.
We see that in the Hurricane Center discussions, in the hazards affecting land, the storm surge part, it'll say higher in the heads of bays and
Yep.
rivers. That matters too.
It's really counterintuitive. So historically, we put our ships and we put our marinas in bays, in
Right.
harbors. In most
Protected, so to speak.
conditions,
Right.
that's the safe place. But you get into a storm surge situation where these really intense winds are just funneling the water into these pinch points, bays, harbors, pinch points and funnel points of sounds, like the southwestern part of Long Island Sound. When you
Mm-hmm.
look at the big storms that impacted Long Island, the mid-Atlantic states, the Northeast in 1938, 1944, 1954, you'll often see the southwestern part of Long Island Sound, because if you think about counterclockwise circulation around a hurricane,
Right.
when there's a hurricane centered around Long Island Sound, you just get these winds screaming from east to west, pushing the water in this sound that's becoming narrower and narrower. So you get to the eastern part actually of Metro New York City near LaGuardia Airport, you get these localized incredible maximums because of the coastal shape.
Right.
Another place that comes to mind too, we were talking about coastal Mississippi. When you look at the map, you can really see the Mississippi River Delta in Louisiana
Yeah.
juts out into the Gulf right there, and it sort of makes this 90-degree angle.
Yep.
And this is part of the secret sauce to Mississippi getting these astronomical surges as well. Not only is the water really shallow, but when you center a hurricane southeast of New Orleans, you're getting these east to west winds to the north of the center of circulation. And that water is just coming across the northern Gulf, and then it hits the Mississippi River Delta and has nowhere to go. So there's kind of this 90-degree angle there in the coast as well. So that makes sense that, yeah, coastal Mississippi is getting, Katrina was the highest storm surge on record in the Western Hemisphere. So this isn't just big time for the US. This is big
Right.
time on a global scale.
I mean, right. And that was the first year that we were doing this project live. We were in Mississippi, Mike Watkins and I, Gulfport. we're going to go over to Waveland, but we had this terrible feeling late in the night of the 28th that I don't know if Waveland is a good idea. I know we can stay at the fire department and we had contacts there and all of that, but we were like, this is our first time out doing
Yeah.
this full on. Let's stick to Gulfport. And boy, even Gulfport was hammered by that surge. The Mississippi Sound so efficient at just rising very quickly. So we have the storm surge threat, from obviously the wind stress, and we know about bathymetry, the shape of the coastline. What about the wave energy? Because the surge level, the water comes up,
Yeah.
but oftentimes people don't think about that wave energy.
Well,
And some of my most dramatic video is from some of these big waves that just come in.
yeah.
We have not captured a house getting collapsed by one, which is good. We don't want to see that happen, but I think it would be really interesting to see it happen if it's going to happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if it's going to happen, we want to document it.
Right.
If we can
Sure.
show the process.
Well,
Uh,
and I think that's helpful for science communication. I hear people saying, "Hey, I'm going to be okay. It's a 7 foot storm surge, and my house is elevated
exactly.
9 feet." And
Right.
you have to understand too, the storm surge is really the height of it's really the level height above what it normally would be if you didn't have a storm. It does not include wave action. So
Right.
you hear people say, "Hey, my 9 foot house is going to be okay. We're only going to seven foot surge." Well, they're not thinking about the 4, 5, 6 foot
Exactly.
waves that are coming in on top of that. So
And
the
how
wave
fast are those waves moving? They're trucking in there.
they're moving in pretty quick. And the other thing that's interesting when you get the really shallow water, like Mississippi, for
Hmm.
example, the good thing is the waves are breaking many, many times. So
Right.
you're not usually looking at the monsters you're seeing offshore,
Right.
but still, all you need is a 3, 4, 5 foot
Yeah.
wave house, and that's enough.
Sure.
I want to mention this too. It's interesting where you have deeper water, like in Hawaii.
Right.
So it makes sense, deeper water, lower surge. But the waves, the type of waves surfers would ride are just astronomical. So a good
Yeah.
example of this is Hurricane Aniki in 1992, made landfall in Hawaii as a Cat 4. So when you're thinking a Cat 4 landfall, that must have a monster surge. Mark, the surge was only 6 feet, but
Right.
the waves were 20, 30, 40 feet. So a lot of in the Hawaii database I built, they talk a lot about the surf levels and a lot of wave run up that
Yeah.
if you only have a 4 foot surge, if you're getting 30 foot waves, that's going to do something called wave run up. Those
Yeah.
waves are basically going to run up on the beach, and
Yeah.
they're bringing a lot of energy. They're bringing a lot of force with them because they haven't broken a lot of times like they do in
Sure.
shallow water. So you're getting hit by bigger waves out there.
Yeah. These multifaceted hazards like storm surge, it's not just one thing, one component. Oh, the water is going to come up. They're forecasting 4 to 6 feet above normally dry ground. It used to be a datum and stuff that's more complicated for people to visualize. I'm glad that they changed it. I think that was 2014, if I'm not mistaken, was the first year that they started saying above ground level,
Yes.
normally dry ground. And so that's what it's referring to, that there is the wave energy, there is the run up potential, there's rip currents, that can happen indirectly related to the whole thing. But it's just because of the presence of the hurricane, the energy that is put into the water, these swells come out,
Yeah.
and that is the harbinger. We see it when we go out, we're doing our work. We know that's the sign. That's it. There's that
Yeah.
energy coming in. And all the while, especially in areas like the Gulf of Mexico, I think about Bolivar Peninsula and Galveston. Mike Watkins and I were down at Bermuda Beach Thursday night. I'd even been Wednesday night. Got to remember my time scale, but we were trying to figure out where we were going to set up one of these old versions of the camera system. And it was late at night, and we could see the moon, and the run up was already starting, and the dunes were already getting annihilated. And we were getting in the east, we call it overwash. But it's more of just the water just kind of coming on in towards what's the main highway that goes south, San Luis Pass or something like that.
Yeah, on Galveston Island,
Yeah.
it's really the Seawall Boulevard becomes the coastal road down to San Luis Pass.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, it was almost coming up to there,
Sure.
like already. And it's like,
Yeah.
you just there's so much energy out there. So let's talk real quick too about international issues with surge. You talked about the Philippines, and you get the big typhoons out there. I can't even imagine. You see some of the stuff that Morgerman has
Sure.
encountered, a lot of it at night, like, oh. But let's talk about Otis a little bit. You went down, you had a great presentation at the National Tropical Weather Conference. just riveting with your post analysis work, interviewing people. So, simple question, hopefully, was Otis a prolific surge producer? And if not, or if so, which way did it go and why?
Yeah, so Mark, this was really the first Cat 5 ever to make landfall anywhere on that central Pacific Mexico coast near Acapulco. I
Hard
mean,
to believe, but
this
yeah,
thing blew up. Really, the intensification, the NHC report really believes that it intensified by 80 knots or more than 90 miles an hour in just 15 hours. That'll take you from a tropical storm to a Cat 5 hurricane in 15 hours. So this was a very small, compact hurricane
right,
that made landfall very close to Acapulco in October of 2023. The wind damage is beyond what I've ever seen. I mean, it
sure,
for me far eclipsed even what I saw in Hurricane Michael in
right,
2018. You have whole high rises that are just completely gutted.
right,
Often we think, you hear run from the water, hide from the wind. This concept that you can hide from wind, you can go in an interior
right.
room and just wind.
That's
Generally, that makes sense up to maybe Cat 4 or Cat 5, but I saw high rises where entire floors were just completely gutted except for the elevator shaft.
right.
And
Oh,
there's no way you could have survived that. So it
right,
was just wind damage like I've never seen before. We think the winds were probably in the 160s sustained miles per hour. That takes it up to a Cat 5. And again, a lot of people would probably expect to hear about a monster storm surge on the coast. I saw very little evidence of storm surge. There were a few boats that were washed inland, and
right,
I talked to people. They said there was a small surge there, but I think it might have been around 6 feet or so in the worst case scenario. I think a lot of the areas were probably getting massive waves on the
sure,
shore, but a pretty small surge. And again, listeners may say, how in the world can you have a Cat 5
right.
hurricane and a small surge? I think three things going on: the small size of it. The
Yep,
forecast advisory from NHC suggested the hurricane force winds only extended out about 30 miles as this thing
yeah,
approached the coast. It's a very compact storm, which is what enabled it to intensify so quickly.
right. Part of
Also, the
that,
rapid intensification. We talk about the importance of pre-landfall winds.
right,
18 hours before landfall, this thing is nowhere near a Cat 5. So it just did not have as much time to push
right,
water. And then the bathymetry is a huge reason. We just don't see a lot of big surges in Pacific Mexico because the water's so deep.
right.
If you're familiar at all with Acapulco and their history and their entertainment, world famous cliff divers
Yeah.
dive off the cliffs. They barely clear the rocks. Mark,
And
they're
then,
diving into 12 feet of water.
yeah,
In Mississippi, how far offshore do you have to get
right,
12 feet of water?
yeah,
Miles, right? So
right.
just that deep water there, it's protecting them from big surges. So mostly what we saw there really was almost entirely wind damage from the Cat 5 winds, but again, not a big surge. So you really do need to think about your coastal profile, your bathymetry. That really determines a lot of your risk from storm surge.
What about the Cayman Islands and their vulnerability to storm surge? How much do you know about our
Yeah,
Caribbean friends?
Mark, generally when we get to island areas, storm surge is more locally generated. And this is what I mean. These big Gulf Coast events can really flood hundreds of miles of coastline. It's just this
Good point.
broad swath of water. When you get into island areas, it's very different because depending on what side of the island you're at, depending on where you
Yeah,
are compared to the wind field, you could have a huge surge in one location and 3 miles away, they're not getting anything. So it's very locally driven. And so it really depends more on where you are in comparison to that onshore eye wall. And again, you can get an area, you're not seeing the type of surges you're going to see in Louisiana or
right.
Mississippi, but especially where you have a concave shaped coastline, a bay, a harbor,
Yeah, it
if
makes
that
sense.
engages with the onshore eye wall, you will not see a gradual buildup over time. That's where it's going to look more like the stereotypical tsunami. All of a sudden, your water level goes from a foot above normal to
Gotcha.
12 feet above
Yeah,
normal
yeah,
in 30 minutes because
yeah.
that eye wall is just engaged on that harbor. In
Makes
island
sense.
areas, you tend to get a lot of strange shapes, a lot of concave shapes, and that's the concern. You can get a very localized storm
Right.
surge that devastates one island, and the other side of the island is untouched. So it's very localized depending on your aspect and where you are in relation to the storm.
Now, does that also sort of hold true for the Florida Keys, obviously made up of a bunch of islands?
Oh, for sure. I mean, we see these localized patterns now. Where you get to something like a key, if the maximum elevation is only 5 feet, these surges, I mean, we're looking at, think about the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. it pushed about 18 feet of surge over the keys. So you have these keys that are
So the
only 5
dome
feet high.
overtook it. Yeah,
It's going
yeah,
to overwash it. So
yeah.
in those areas where
God.
you have smaller keys, where you have atolls and these smaller sandbars and sand islands, the surge is just going to wash right over you. It's more where you have volcanic islands, or you have some rock, or you have
Yeah.
some buildup coral, and you have some elevation there, and you're not going to get overwashed. Then you start getting these really localized surge patterns. And in any island areas, it could be the Florida Keys, the Caribbean, the Philippines. You're going to see those general patterns in any places like that.
So in your work over the years in studying storm surge, is there any one part of the US coast, and it might even be a specific city that, for the better way, maybe a better way to put it, but keeps you up at night, where you're like, man, I
Yeah,
really hope we don't
you
see
could actually use that
here.
phrase, and it's the west coast of Florida, especially near Tampa, St. Pete, down through Sarasota, Siesta Key, all the way down to Venice. I was literally going down neighborhoods and knocking on doors the day before Ian, when the best track about a day before
Yeah,
landfall showed it coming in by Sarasota. I was 30 miles south of there talking to people in these neighborhoods in Venice, Florida. They're one block in from the sand dunes, elevation 7 feet in a non-elevated house. NHC at the time was saying 8 to 12 feet of surge.
you
These
knew
people
that,
are
yeah.
boarding up windows and planning to ride it out. And I'm explaining surge, and they're looking at me like I just got off a spaceship from
Right.
Mars. I mean, and what's hard about the west coast of Florida is you get people saying, "Look, man, I've been through hurricanes for 40 years." And they've never been on the strong side of a large, powerful Gulf landfall. They're thinking through history where they're either on the weak side,
Right.
or they're thinking of storms like Andrew or Katrina that moved across the peninsula from east to west. The strongest winds would have been north of the eye, pushing a negative surge out of Tampa Bay. And they have 20, 30, 40 years experience of hurricanes as wind events and rain events. And they've never actually been on that strong side of a Gulf landfalling hurricane. And I mean, that still for me is just so heavy and somber. Talking to people that you're like, there's a good chance they're going to be dead 24 hours from now. And
Gina,
they're thinking like, I'm a Martian. Like, what in the world is this guy
right?
talking about? We don't get surges here.
And we do want to touch upon the communication side of this eventually, because we are battling a lot now with social media. It can be very powerful. It can also work against us. And again, you talked about history. History can work against us. We know it, and we're out there. You remind me a lot of sort of the legendary aspects of Isaac Klein, where legend has it that he rode up and down the beach of Galveston warning people. And there's some that dispute that, I know, but like that's what that reminds me of, Hal, that you did that. I did that to some extent, not on a horse, but Matt and I, my colleague that was helping me during Ian, we were talking to a family that was staying in the Coral Springs area, I think, somewhere around there near Fort Myers. And they were staying and they had pets and children. And we were just
Yeah.
like, you gotta go. And they didn't. There was like, there's no way we can. They had all these reasons why they couldn't. And they lost everything. The water came up, cars gone, the water got in. You know how intrusive that water is. It's such a horrible, penetrative, whether it's freshwater flooding, which is like a whole other beast
Yeah.
that we'll talk about in another edition of Hurricane U, and then the saltwater flooding. But man, I was like, Matt, because he knew this family. I was like, can you please anything you can to get them to leave? And they just
Yeah.
couldn't. They had so many different pets and everything. We hear that story how over and over again. It's either history, oh, I went through whatever and it'll be fine,
Yeah.
or your pet, oh, I've got this dog or this
Yeah.
exotic lizard or a big parrot, or I can't go to a hotel with the thing. Like you're talking about your life. And at the end of the day, I guarantee you folks, Hal and I, and people at the National Hurricane Center, and anybody you see on TV telling you about this stuff, our number one goal, it is not cliche, it is true. We want you to survive. You
That's
have
it.
to survive. And the only way to do that is you got to evacuate.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Ian, that was really tough.
Mark, I
Lost
talk,
over 100 people.
I try to go before, during, and after, and I'll stay around a week after a storm because I just want to. That for me is my best schooling of the year. Just talking to dozens of these people I don't come with a lot of shame. I'm not going to slap them on the wrist. I really want to know, what do they need?
Right. That's
And
the
I also want to
scientist in
know,
you, right? You're
and I also want to
observing.
know what they learned. I'll often ask them, if you could go back a week in time and tell yourself one thing, what would you tell your? I just want to really know where they get their information from, how they made their decisions. I'm not coming to shame
Oh,
them and say
right,
you should have done this or that.
right.
I'm just really coming to sympathize. Sometimes I'll have people break down and cry, and I'm there
Sure.
also, if I can be an empathetic shoulder to cry on, that's fine too. But I just kind of try to just observe and listen. And hearing these stories, the Ian stories were so heavy. There was a couple from the Midwest. They came down from Illinois, almost died in Ian in Fort Myers Beach. And they said the day before the storm, this is where you talk about history working against you. They said everyone back home and in different parts of the US said, you need to get out of there. They said that people telling us we'll be fine and laughing because we were newcomers were the locals. They said the locals on our street were having hurricane parties right up until landfall. And
What's
then all of a
missing?
sudden they're in 12 feet of water and drowning. And it was the locals having hurricane parties and saying, look, we've been here since 1972. You're just scared because you haven't seen this before. And they really just, we're really flippant towards it, and very, not willing to evacuate, very, very opposed to the idea that this could be a dangerous storm. And
Mm.
we talked to some other people who said, we heard the surge forecast loud and clear. We heard about 12, 14 feet of surge. And we
But
just, we just
right.
could not believe that a hurricane could push that much water. And I thought that was interesting, because I always thought, if we can forecast this accurately and communicate it and reach the audience, game over, we've won. And what I
Right.
learned from there is, you have another obstacle of people literally not believing it. Like, how can you tell someone who's lived there for 45 years what's about to happen is way beyond anything that you've seen or could imagine? It's almost unimaginable for these people that haven't seen it in their area. Mark, you're going out to these hurricane zones all the time. You're like, oh, I've seen this before and it can be bad. But how do you communicate that to
Yeah.
someone who's been in a certain neighborhood for 42 years and they're like, it doesn't get that doesn't happen around here?
It is. It's very difficult. We saw it during Michael, talking to people at Mexico Beach that were not believing the forecasts. And, we might as well jump into that communication side. Why not? The one that I hear the most is, that's what they always say. They always say that, and it never happens. And it's like, oh, Max Mayfield, former director of the National Hurricane Center, paraphrasing it here, he was on a national network, and the reporter asked him, the anchor asked him, well, don't these hurricanes always weaken before they make landfall, Max? Like, this is all just so much hoopla, and they seem to weaken right before landfall. And Max very simply said, yeah, well, they do, except for the ones that don't. There you go. I mean, that's it. That's the answer. That is such
Yeah.
thesis, but it's hard. And look, we do that, and that's the thing. And Hal gets it. We're not blaming people. There's a reason that this complacency, this misunderstanding, is sort of baked in. That's a whole other thing. Like, not everybody's going to be a big weather geek. We just have to,
Yeah.
grasp.
Mark, the day after Ian, I talked to this British woman who said, I've evacuated 2 or 3 times already. Nothing
There's that.
happened.
Yep.
This time I thought again, nothing's going to happen. She said, as the water started to enter my house, I realized my friend down the street has an elevated house on higher ground. So she went out higher than waist deep water in the street that's starting to carry her away, and she was swimming for it. She made it and survived. But from her perspective, I've evacuated several times and nothing happened, right? And you get people that are on fixed income, or
Yeah.
they're caring for an elderly relative
Sure.
that's on oxygen, or they have pets, or there are all kinds of reasons why people don't evacuate, and some of them are legitimate reasons. But
Yes.
like you said, people aren't really picturing how bad this can be. And at the end of the day, it's really your life at risk if you don't take precautions and you happen to be in that area with a really big surge.
Yes, and I think about Naples and Collier County, and I believe that Ian, and I think this is just very simple. We could probably prove it if we ever needed to, but I think it's just obvious. Ian is the most filmed storm surge event in human history, and it's not because of people like me or Max Olson or the other storm chasers or any work that you did. It's because of all the people that stayed and used these. some of which took those videos, and that's the last thing they ever did. And that is what happened. They drowned afterwards. And that is not good. That is like they were filming. You saw it how they had video, and outside the water is like a fishbowl. And they're commenting, look at the water out there. And it's like, what are we doing? This is 2022. Everything's coming through on your phone, the television, people. I mean, other than Dan Summers, the director of emergency management in Collier, flying over in a helicopter, and maybe they did, yelling down, you know, get out. Like, what are we missing here? And Naples is not some kind of a, well, people didn't know. It's not a very educated area. Bull is very economically, like McLarens and other $1 million vehicles, Teslas floating away. Like, what if we can't get Naples to comply? It's almost like throw up your hands and give up, because that is an educated, rich area, to put a fine point on it, and they didn't get it. We're like,
yeah, Mark, it's complex. There's a bunch of levels to it. You get people just not believing it, but
that's the
and
bottom
this gets
line.
into a bit of communication as well. I've really shifted in recent years to communicating the impacts. At the end of the day, people want to know, is my house going to have wind damage? Is my house going to flood? Really, what they want to see is a map of the likely wind damage or destructive winds and destructive water. And I think sometimes there's so much fixation on the cone of uncertainty, which is where potential areas of the eye location. But I think that implies for people who are very busy people, and they're often only looking at one graphic. They're not reading the NHC advisory. They're not looking in depth. They're very busy people trying to come home from work, get dinner on the table, and get their kid to sports practice. They have a moment, and they're looking at the cone of uncertainty, and they're saying, oh, it's probably going to pass to the west of us. And I think if we really focus on, this is where we're likely to see destructive winds, this is where we're likely to see life-threatening water, and almost the cone as a very side footnote, I think people would begin to say, hang on a second, because we look at Ian, even with the cone forecasting shifting, we still see those storm surge warnings in those areas that had life-threatening surge. That wasn't really shifting that much. And so I think some of this is just also a communications thing where people are in a hurry. They glance at the cone map. Oh, it looks like it's going to miss us. And again, a hurricane's not a point. A hurricane track is not a line. It's really this broad area of winds and this very broad area of water. And that's not really what people are seeing in the way that we depict this on maps, you know?
You know, you're exactly right. And the cone, and you said it over and over, it is going to do this. It is going to, that's what I hear people say that. We'll go out to dinner as a team and we'll hear people talking about said hurricane. And you'll hear them say, oh, I heard that it is supposed to do that. And I'm like, if they only could grasp what they're talking about, they are looking at it when they say it as the I.
Yes.
Because that's what they're looking at.
Like,
oh, it. Like, what do you, and I want to pull them aside and say, hey, what's your name? I'm Bob. Okay, Bob. When you say it, I heard that it is supposed to go here or go there. What do you think it is? Well, the hurricane. And what do you mean? Like, you could start drilling down.
Yeah.
And then after you're done, educate them. No. It is the whole ball of wax.
That's it.
It's the rain bands. It is the potential tornadoes. It is the 20 inches of rain. Thinking about Ian, you know, it is that massive storm surge. It's the whole thing. Yeah. That's it. That's the name, Hurricane Ian. But people think of it as this little dot on a map. Oh, and it is going to pass to our west. Well, we're good.
You know, Mark, I think some of this is a failure of us as a science, you know, scientists or the science field, scientists that are forecasting and communicating this. Often, if you think back how often we talk about coordinates with the latest advisory centered at 29.4, right? And you're putting a point on a map.
A map, exactly.
Yeah, so but that's how, as kids, right? It was a good geography lesson, latitude and longitude and finding your place on the map. And then we see the spaghetti models. Well, all of a sudden, these are 15 different lines. Which one's going to be right? But again, geometry from junior high, a line is a connection of points. Again, this is a point. So the way we show where it is with the hurricane symbol, it's at a point, and then it's going to track along a line, which is a connection of points. So we're communicating all along off the coast of Africa through the Caribbean. This is a point. This is a point. This is a point. And then it gets close to the coast, and we're like, hang on a second. It's not a point. It's a wind field. It's a massive wall of water inundating 200 miles of coastline. And then we kind of blame the people for not making that quick shift. And I think maybe part of this is how we communicate and visualize and show the maps. And I personally am starting to show more. I'm leading with maps showing the wind field,
Right.
showing I mean, the NHC has maps showing the likeliness of hurricane force winds
Right.
and the likeliness of different levels of storm surge. And I'm like, this is really what people need to see.
Agree.
And, maybe if they want to get into talking about the track of the eye, I think later in a broadcast, there's importance there. But I really think leading with the impacts, this is where we can expect destructive winds. This is where we can expect deadly surge. If those were the leading maps, the leading visuals, the leading messages, I think a lot of lives would be saved.
That is a very, very good point. And I think about back when I was a kid, tracking on these maps from my middle school science teacher who really helped to get me into this in the seventh and eighth grades. And that's exactly right. We're almost deceived into like, oh, it's just a little point all the way across back on when it was all paper. And now we see with the most fancy of the apps and graphics, even like we have on our website and the networks and the Hurricane Center with their maps and graphics, it's lines and points. And then we have colors to try to show wind fields and other areas from point A to point B of storm surge warnings. And it's like, wait a minute, from the get-go, we've been doing this all wrong. It should have been
Well,
impact based going back 80 years, if not more.
and Mark, I've been thinking about this a lot. I think it makes sense because there was a time really for your models to work, they need to forecast where that center of circulation is going. I
Yeah,
mean, that's really that's the puppeteer pulling the strings of the puppet, right? Like where the eye goes determines where all these impacts go.
true.
And then I
We
think
know
the
that.
challenge through the
Right.
60s and 70s and 80s became, hey, with better geostationary satellites, now we can see the eye. Now we can forecast where the eye is going. So the scientific community really got on board with let's improve our technology to locate where, because there was a time where we didn't quite know where the center of circulation was, right? We
Sure.
just knew from ship reports something's out there. Then
Right.
with satellites and radar, now we can see the eye. This is great. This is an advancement. And now we're forecasting where that eye is going to go. But I think we never quite made the transition to communicating to the public. Hang on a second, that's almost important for the models. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, my neighbor who's a waiter or waitress, they really want to know what's the risk of wind damage and what's the risk of flood damage where I live,
Sure.
regardless of if the eye goes over my house or 40 miles away, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So back to storm surge as the
I'm
topic.
sorry if I get on a
No, no,
soapbox there.
no.
I get
No,
passionate
no. This
about this
is
stuff.
it's all related because when we get down to communication of the totality of the event, and we talk about storm surge, there have certainly been a tremendous amount of advancements in that arena over even just my career going back 30 years. There are these hurricane evacuation studies that the Army Corps of Engineers will do in coordination with state and local officials. Then we have, storm surge inundation maps that have been put out over the years. I was a part of that in the Carolinas and Georgia and even parts of New York in the late 90s, early 2000s. Now we're in the era of advanced augmented reality graphics. We have a lot of video now that we can show from past events. This is what it looked like in
Yep.
Cedar
Yep.
Key or Mexico Beach during Michael or whatever. Um, and we are doing a good job
Yeah.
because we are, even though more than 100 people died in the surge from Ian, without the technology and without the advancements and without all the social science, more people would have died.
Sure.
So we're making progress. However, it is still one of those things that is just going to be looming. We cannot let our guard down. More people are moving to the coastline. We're building in these areas still. The infrastructure, the road networks, you think about the
Yeah.
Keys, man. You get one of those Labor Day hurricane deals that just, oh, it's a tropical storm when I went to bed. And we saw with Otis. Otis is that reminder. We can still be caught off guard. And it might be a small hurricane that'll do that. But man, US 1 coming out of the Keys, that is still a major disaster. Highway 12 coming out of the Outer Banks of North Carolina, getting everybody out from
Yeah.
Hatteras Village North, Norfolk, Charleston, got to get people out of there.
Yeah.
Tampa, we talked about. We can still have a major multi-thousand death hurricane event if enough things go wrong. It's not like we have eliminated that threat. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. 100%. Surge is the big killer. And keep in mind, it's not only surge at your house. If you want to evacuate, think about the route you have to take. Is there a pinch point over a creek or a bayou or a low spot that's going to get inundated 18 hours before landfall or 24 hours before landfall? So all you need is one pinch point under 6 feet of water, and you're not going anywhere. So surge is really, I think, the big killer. So many people drown, but yeah, we could really be blindsided. I get concerned when I see the rapidly intensifying hurricanes along the Gulf. We've had 6 over the past 7 years
Yeah,
that blew up. I
that's
mean,
remarkable.
intensifying at least 40 miles an hour in that 24 hours before landfall. We've had 6 in 7 years and only 11 since 1950. So we think the water offshore, especially in the Gulf, is substantially warmer than it used to be. It's a lot more fuel for intensification and also to push more surge. And again, these geographically large events can start pushing a lot of water onshore long before landfall. So I am concerned about these storms blowing up a rapid intensification, and where we can't get people out of populated areas, we could really see a high fatality count for sure.
And we've talked a lot about the most important thing, and that is keeping people safe. And we do. We want people to be able to live through these. And that's the number one goal, to save lives. But let's also talk about the economic impact of what storm surge can do. So we can see, understand what it does to a place like Mexico Beach or Southwest Florida, but a massive surge in an area like right up the Houston ship channel. Can we play just a little bit of what if? We haven't seen that, and that's a good thing. I mean, if people knew how lucky we've been, you just look at Laura. You bring Laura into that Houston ship channel area, maybe just west of it. Is that even something we could fathom from an economic, ecological, everything? Not to say anything, yes, we want to save the lives. Let's just assume everybody evacuated and we have 0 deaths. The economic toll would be absolutely beyond anything we could imagine.
I mean, Mark, I live in Galveston Island. A lot of my friends work in the petrochemical industry, and I talk about Laura, and I just don't think they have any comprehension of what that storm was. Around here in the upper Texas coast, people look back at the 1900 storm, deadliest disaster in U.S. history. They think that's a worst case scenario. It was a pretty compact storm with sustained winds in Galveston of 120. I mean, Laura made landfall with 150-mile-an-hour winds. It was geographically larger than the 1900 storm, pushing about, I don't know, 5 or 6 more feet of storm surge. But you just need something near or south of Galveston Bay, and you're putting a tremendous surge into Galveston Bay. Look at Hurricane Carla in 1961, made
Yeah.
landfall on the central Texas coast. And a lot of people think, oh, that was a central Texas coast impact. Galveston Island, 9 feet of surge, but you get into Galveston Bay, 16 feet of storm surge. And again, there was industry there, but
Yeah.
nothing like there is
Nothing
63
like
years
right.
later. So all of a sudden, just when you were talking economically, we could easily see a Carla that is a little bit farther to the east or a Laura that's farther to the west. You could easily see a 20-foot storm surge in Galveston Bay, and just think economically how that just cripples not only the petrochemical industry, but the port of Houston, one of
Right.
the busiest ports in the country. So when you go to a store in Dallas or a store in Oklahoma City and you buy a TV or you buy bananas, that's all coming through the port of Houston. So all that, just the ripple effect on the regional and national economy would just be, I think, astronomical and beyond what most people could even imagine.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what I worry about in any given season, but especially a season where it looks like we're going to have, I kind of refer to it as a lot of lottery tickets, that a high numbers type season, you just have more opportunity for something like that to happen. We always say it only takes one, but a season like 2024, where it just looks like the die are loaded, and then we can see some of the climate models, those have gotten better and better. They're not perfect. They're not going to tell you 3 months out that there's going to be a hurricane in Galveston on August, whatever, but we're seeing these patterns and we're getting closer and closer with the science. And you just start to think, oh my goodness, this year it's just not looking good.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
how many
you
times can we get lucky?
hate to see these water temps so warm, and a lot of places have been lucky. We look at Florida, they've been, besides Ian, there have been a lot of monsters very close to the Florida Peninsula that nearly missed. And then we look at Laura 4 years ago, that the heart of that impact was in the coastal marshes of
Yeah.
Louisiana, not the populated areas of Louisiana or Texas. So we've been pretty lucky in general when you look back at the past decade, and you got to wonder when that luck runs out for our more populated areas. Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Tampa Metro, New Orleans again, Houston, Galveston, at some point you roll the dice enough and you're going to get a big human impact and economic impact as well.
So what I like to try to do, we're talking about a very serious thing here, a huge energy source, a force of nature that is absolutely, it's pretty much like as different the eye wall of a hurricane on Earth as the weather is on Jupiter on any given
Sure.
day. It is incredible. And there's a lot of scariness to it. There is, because these are deadly events. They have economic consequences. So, especially this year, because of all the doom scrolling and everything that's going on in our world, I'm trying to give people some hope. What can we do? You've telling us all this bad news. It's like if you go to the
Yeah.
doctor and says your cholesterol is high, you're overweight, your glucose is this, whatever, and he just walks out, you'd fire the doctor.
Sure.
He's probably going to tell you, go see a nutritionist, go to the gym, do this, do that, give you some pamphlets, whatever, gives you some hope, hopefully. So I want to try to do the same. We have made a lot of strides in storm surge prediction science and so forth, but let's just break it down and make it real easy for people. There is hope, right? You can mitigate, we can talk about that, and you can evacuate. So let's start with the evacuation part first. We get these warnings, they're out early enough. That is the key. And just, it's easy for us to say, but we know, don't second guess it. If you're told to go, that's what you should do. And I know, again, it's so easy for us to say, but the tools are there to save your life.
That's for sure. And Mark, the thing is, a lot of people, if a hurricane's coming in midday on Wednesday, most people want to evacuate at dawn the day before landfall. So you get stuck in that gridlock. I just tell people all the time, just go an extra day early when the roads are open, when you can stop for gas and they're not out of fuel, when you can go to an ATM and get cash and it's not out of cash. Just leave earlier. Your house doesn't have to be perfect. And we think, if your house was on fire in the middle of the night and there were flames and smoke and you escaped with your life, you'd be happy.
That's a
just
good
running out of your house. You lost everything, but you saved your life. You'd say, thank God, right?
Yep.
But when it's a hurricane, for some reason, people get into this. I need to have 48 to 60 hours to prepare everything perfectly. And it's overwhelming. And at some point, you know what? I'm just going to stay. And then they lose their life. So your house doesn't have to be perfect. You can replace anything you own. You can't replace your life. So I always tell people, just make it a hurricane. Go 2 or 3 days early. Find a friend or relative 2 or 3 hours away that you wanted to go see anyway. A lot of people more and more can work remotely. So
good point.
Spend that extra $150 on fuel and eating out a few times. And if nothing happened, you left on open roads, you came back on open roads, and you still have your house. Call it a win. Just if you live in a vulnerable area, if you live near the coast or the Atlantic coast, you just have to build into your mind that just has to be a normal part of living there. There are going to be times you need to get out.
You got to have it ingrained that is what you're going to do, that it's just second nature and you just do it. I don't live near the water. And anytime we get a hurricane threat, because we have have little kids, they're getting older now, but just for the not wanting to have to go through it, my family leaves, they head up to Greensboro, even for a Category 1, because you just don't want to deal with it. And they go early, and they're on I-40, and they're in the Greensboro area in 3 hours, and it is not a big deal. These are very stressful events. That stress, me just getting ready for one to go tackle it as a mission, sometimes, especially when it's a really serious event that could have generational impacts, like Laura as an example, or Ian, just for me, that stress can be crushing. And Hal and I, believe me, because I know the guy in person. I don't just know him from the internet. We've met, we've interacted. He has empathy. We know what you're going through. We're not just what's the expression? We're not just speaking about it or whatever. We know, we get it. But that is important, the evacuation and the planning. You've got to do it ahead of time. And I like what you said, Hal, about making it into a positive. Again,
that's right.
You're going to go see somebody you hadn't seen in a while. If it's in the fall, there's football games, baseball games still going on. Maybe take in a professional. There's college basketball, not yet. We better not have hurricanes in December when the basketball season really kicks off. But there
Mark,
are
you're in North
college
Carolina.
football
I mean,
games.
you're thinking about basketball every day of the year.
Right. Yeah, you're right. But yes, it is monumentally stressful for people, and people that have been through it and they're watching this, they're like, yeah, preach it. We know. So try to turn it into something positive. But look, you're new to an area. You got to find out where your evacuation zones are. Is that easier to do now than ever before? I hope. I take you for granted because I already know. But like if you just moved to wherever coastal USA and you want to know, am I in an evacuation zone? Is that easy to look up, Hal, or is it still cumbersome?
You actually even see them just driving around your town. If you live in a coastal area that's prone to hurricanes, you're going to see those evacuation signs. And I want to say this too, Mark, if you leave 3 days early, you don't like where I live in Galveston, there's one main interstate going north. I
Yeah,
talk to elderly people who say we never drive the interstate ever. What would we do? And I say, if this storm is still in Cuba coming towards Texas, leave 3 or 4 days early. You can drive the coastal roads 3 days early.
there you
You can
go.
get out of here without touching
Thank
an
you.
interstate
Yep,
if you're leaving on Sunday for a Wednesday storm. But if you're leaving on Tuesday for a Wednesday storm, now the coastal roads are out. So that's again, if you can just go early, you can find more creative ways. You can stay off the interstates.
yeah.
You have time to make your way and go and see your cousin or your friend or your sister.
Sure.
It's a positive experience.
So what are some of the as we try to wrap this up here, I could do this just chat about surge and our experiences for a long time. And before we wrap up, I do want to have you plug your podcast that you do. We'll make sure we get that in before we sign off because there is more of where Hal Needham came from, by the way, folks. But so um like in your experience and my experience, the collective work between the two of us, over the years, what would you say would be the best advice that you can give somebody when they're dealing with storm surge? Like if you only had 30 seconds in an elevator, you met somebody, I just moved down here and they got to get off at the sixth floor of whatever hotel. What do you tell them about how to deal with storm surge?
Yeah, I mean, you just don't want to mess with it. You don't want to drive through it. You don't want to walk through it. You don't want to be in a house that's getting inundated by it. Again, this is
Avoid it.
fast moving water that's often full of chemicals, backed up sewage. You don't want to
Oh,
even walk in
right.
it. So you just want to stay away from this. It's a bit unpredictable. It's hard to even as a scientist know exactly where it's going, but it's just again just so harmful, so dangerous. You don't want to be anywhere really around it. And so, just if you live and most communities will have maps, evacuation maps. Usually your evacuation maps are based on surge potential, not wind risk. And so
Right.
look at what your city government has, look at FEMA and different, anyone involved with emergency management. If you're in a coastal zone, they're going to have evacuation maps. That's usually based on elevation and really understanding a bit about your community flood history. You can get an idea if you have any risk at all. If you're near the coast or on the coast, that's staying away from the surge or getting inland. I would just say err
That's
on
your
the side of
priority. Yeah.
caution because you hear people all the time that said, I thought I could get out. I thought I could ride this out. And all of a sudden they're up to their neck in water.
But you got to commit to it now. You're in an evacuation area. Surge could get me. You got to decide. It's not one of the, well, you know what? We'll wait and we'll see. They always say, look, we're telling you, you have to just commit to it now. And we're going to go. Here's how we're going to do it. Here's what we're going to do. So, Hal, in your work, let's talk about this too before we wrap up. Tell me a little bit more about your USurge and some of the research you've done. You showed some amazing graphics at NTWC on that beautiful LED wall that they had where we can show our presentations. Tim and Alex have really done it well. I love it. The different color codes and like you have really done some really neat work in one of my favorite areas, and that is mapping. So this is your chance. Let's talk about Hal and some of your success for a few minutes,
Yeah.
and then we'll
Well,
wrap
Mark,
it up.
you and I both have a geography background. My degrees are all in geography, and so that's just really mapping out where the risk is for these things. So we know that there are flood maps produced by FEMA and other groups that do computer modeling. What I was interested to do was build comprehensive flood histories for coastal communities, run statistics on those, and come up with what I call data-driven flood risk. So what's your 100-year flood level? Meaning a flood so rare it only happens on average every 100 years. What's that level according to observed data back to the 1800s? And how does that compare to the computer generated maps produced by FEMA and other groups? And so
Right,
that's been really interested to build those maps and to show this is what we think the 100-year flood is, or the 50-year flood, or this is where the different risks of inundation are. So, and again, that's based on your observed history for your community. So I've built those for about 45 different coastal communities where, again, you can know your flood history. You can know if your house
right,
would have flooded before based on your
right.
elevation. And again, it's based on your local history there. And then using that, we can get a better idea of your risk where you're living. And we can actually calculate the odds that you would flood in a 30-year mortgage in a house. So imagine someone saying, wow, okay,
Yep.
I know I have a 75% chance of flooding in a 30-year mortgage. That can change their perspective on your
Sure.
risk. So that's all part of the USurge project. Again, that's the US Storm Surge database. We're not only wanting to build those histories, but use those data to understand flood risk. And then we've been doing a lot of work in recent years also building elevation maps for communities. So
Right.
like where I live in Galveston, we have all of our flood history. We ran stats on that. And then we have a map with the elevation of most of the buildings in our community that we can overlay on that. So we can say, okay, show us the data-driven 100-year flood and how many buildings would be inundated, how much water would be in each building. We can really get to that granular level. And where we're going with this is eventually address-based flood forecasting that
That's
you
the
can use
key.
if there's
Yes.
you can use this if there's an active storm in the Gulf. If the Hurricane Center says your community can expect 7 to 9 feet of storm surge, we could take the upper bound of that and say how many houses would flood in your community and if your house would flood. And we can also use that for long-term risk. Should you buy insurance? But
Right.
what about for real estate transactions? I want to buy this house. Has it flooded before? USurge says it's flooded twice, and here's how much water
Oh,
each
it's
time.
like Carfax. It should be called Surge Fact.
Exactly. And people really need to know this information.
They
These
do.
surge events are billions of dollars of losses. If you know anyone that's had a storm surge event in their house, just the recovery process, getting the
Yeah.
mold out, mucking out the mud and the insurance process, it's traumatic. It can be way more traumatic than the storm itself. And so we really think people should know this information for their community. And we're all doing that with USurge. Really, the address-based flood forecasting, that's through a product called Flood Information Systems. And then finally, I host the #1 podcast for natural disasters. It's called the GeoTrack podcast. It's all about science education, but it's really stories behind disasters. It's these stories about extreme weather and natural disasters not covered by the mainstream media. We're on the ground not only in hurricanes, but in wildfires,
Yeah.
blizzards, tornado, severe weather events, you name it. We're trying to cover this and really understand the human aspect, but also interview a lot of researchers along the way.
See, that's the human aspect. Geographers, we study the people, places, and things that, in this situation, that the weather impacts. That's the way I look at it. So that's incredible. And I was thinking as you were talking about the address-based, if we get there, and that's what my wife really wants. She says, I just want to know, because oh, this is great. She's going to shoot me like, don't talk about me. I'll come to her and I'll be like, oh, look, here's the HRR model and it's showing storms and they're going to come through. She's like, dude, is it going to rain at Josh's tennis or soccer or not? And now the stuff's actually getting there. We know the Fox Weather app, as an example, will say rain is expected in your area between 5 and 6 p.m. And I'm like, I know it's getting that from some algorithm based on
Yeah.
the cams and blah, blah, blah. Like, doggone it. That's what I was trying to tell you.
Well,
But
Mark,
she's got a
you
point.
you
She
and I
wants
and a
to
lot
know.
of our colleagues, we're weather nerds, right?
Right.
When there's a hurricane advisory, we're going to read every word.
Right.
We're going to dig deep because we're passionate about it. But
We are.
if I could
But the public doesn't have time for passion sometimes.
if I could summarize the people I meet in these hurricane zones, and they're across all walks of life, if I had one word to summarize them, it would be busy. Everyone's just incredibly busy and they have a moment to look at a forecast. And I realize they don't have 5 minutes for my detailed discussion about wind shear and millibars. They just literally want to know, is my garage going to flood or not? Do I need to move my stuff? That's their question for 90% of them. And so the more we can move towards giving them what they want, they were just
right.
For a lot of these people, they don't want to think about severe weather. They don't want to think about extreme weather. They're preparing for a cruise. Their daughter's getting married. This is what people want to think about. You and I are kind of freaks of nature. We like thinking about storms. Most people just want to live their life. The storm is an interruption. And if we can hand them, this is what we think your flood risk is for this storm or long term, I think it's really going to help them.
You know what? I'm going to make a thumbnail for one of my video discussions because mine can be 15 to 20 minutes. Today was 40 because it was a longer introduction to the beginning of the hurricane season for the Pacific. There was reasons behind it, but when there's a hurricane coming, they can be 15, 20 minutes long. And people have told me, oh, I'll listen to it on 2x speed or whatever. I'll listen to it while I'm driving or look, I get it. And people want to know, like my wife, she's like, I need to know in about 30 seconds or less, what's the deal? I'm like, there's no way. But so anyway, I think and I'm going to do it. And I'll send it to you when I do it. I don't know what hurricane it'll be, but it's coming. The thumbnail will be up, and I'll probably do an AI generated whatever to make it hit home. And the title is going to be, "Is my garage going to flood?" And that'll get a lot of people watching.
For
But here's
sure.
the thing, it's not going to be a 30-second video. If you live in Fort Myers, yes, or whatever, it'll still be a 15-minute video because I got to explain
Yeah,
we don't know if your garage is going to flood, and
sure.
here's why. Because even how, if we get down to what do you call it? The augmented reality, where you got your house. I mean, look at what they do with, like, on Amazon. You can see a product in your room. Well, show me storm surge in my garage. We're not far
Exactly.
from there.
Oh yeah, yeah,
But if that hurricane shrinks, expands, does anything changes, even in an hour, your
yeah.
garage doesn't flood. And then you go, it didn't flood. It said it was going to flood. It didn't flood. Here's the video that the augmented reality showed me of my garage, and there's my lawnmower floating. And by golly, it didn't happen. And then the next hurricane comes. I think we're just never going to break this cycle because, dude, it is too intricate to forecast for your address and get it right every single time. So
Yeah,
I believe, and this is kind of a negative, that it is the genie is just out of the bottle. So back to the positive, we do the best we can.
sure.
The public's demanding, they want these short answers, yes or no, and when. Even if we could deliver it, the odds that it would be spot on, I think, are zero because hurricanes are just too unpredictable,
Well,
even in that last hour.
Mark, just weather and weather
Yeah,
forecasting in general is probabilistic, right? It's never a yes or no. It's
that's
always a
right.
scale of likeliness.
We want it to
And
be deterministic,
humans
but
want a
it's
yes
not.
or no. Is it going to be raining on Saturday morning at 9 o'clock for my golf time? And that's where their grumpiness with weather forecasters are always wrong because this is the forecaster said on Thursday, rain is becoming likely this weekend. The guy calls his buddy and says, it's going to rain on Saturday. Let's cancel
Right,
golf. That's not
right,
what the forecaster said.
right,
Forecaster said becoming more likely. The guy
right.
heard it's going to rain, told his buddy it's going to rain. Saturday morning comes, it's not raining. These forecasters are always wrong. The forecaster was speaking probabilistically, but the human mind wants a black or white. And so,
Yeah.
again, I like the idea of reframing the question to know to address, is your house likely to flood or not? Again, it's going to be some scale of likeliness. There's no one on the planet that can take a map of Tampa and say these are the houses that are going to
Yep.
flood and these are the ones that aren't. There's no one in the world that can do that. But I do like the idea of maybe simplifying the conversation to likeliness that your area is going to flood, or at least starting the conversation with flood risk and wind risk instead of getting to that 12 minutes into a broadcast after I've talked about the cone of uncertainty,
Right.
the spaghetti models. Again, they've already tuned out by the time I get to
Agreed.
the real question they have.
So I think to sum this up, we really do need to think of this, the public at large, as an impact problem rather than a track situation
For
as the
sure.
most important thing. And we think about the surge, the wind, the rainfall, and the freshwater flooding that comes with that, and the possibility of tornadoes, especially in some of those rain bands. So if we think about it like that and not just a dot on a map or anything else, that the whole thing is what you're interested in, I think that could really help people. And that's what I try to convey in my videos
Yeah,
on YouTube. And then we go out and we show people through
for
the
sure.
live cams and whatnot. Um, any advancements coming down the pike related to storm surge that you know of from either the National Hurricane Center or in your work? Like, what's the next big thing? And then we'll call it a night
Yeah,
after.
I mean, I really like the concept of storm surge watches and warnings. I think that's long overdue. I'm super
Lightning.
excited about that. And I think, if people can think in terms of watches and warnings, that's an improvement in recent years. I think, just as technology improves, we can assess what's happening. Social media helps us also see what's going on in the ground. So, I think we are moving in a positive direction. Just have to keep improving communication.
Interrupted by my own, see, we are weather geeks. Lightning
Wow,
strike. My lights blinked.
I
Luckily,
saw that.
I was like, uh-oh. I
I
had
guess
my
that
phone
means
in
our time's
airplane.
up, right? When the
Yeah, no
storms hit, our
kidding.
time's up.
You know what the bell means? Wow. See, I had my phone in airplane mode and see it almost bit me. So I didn't want
Yeah,
to, the text come in and people bother me in an airplane mode. I don't have radar scope running, and
Right.
nature reminded me outside of my window, I'm here. So look, we don't want that to happen in a hurricane. That's a good way to segue to close this up. We do have the gift of a lot of advance warning all the way to these big seasonal forecasts that come out. They are helpful. You know, some people don't think they are. I think that they are because they at least raise awareness on a
Sure.
broad scale. We know that in any given year, they could only take one, yes, but there are years when we think, oh, there's going to be a lot of it only takes one. And 2024 could be just one of those years. And we want you to be safe. We want you to be educated and, you know as much as you can about this, because as G.I. Joe said, knowing is half the battle, right?
For sure. Mark, I know you'll be out there in the field. Keep up your great work with cameras and just in general awareness. I'll be on the ground as well. And
And be safe,
forecasting, really
please.
one of the things I like to focus on is looking at the storm surge and what
Right.
that'll look like and doing surge forecasting the best I can. So my
Hopefully.
handles on social media
Yep.
are Hurricane Hal. People can follow me there. And again, GeoTrek, GeoTrek. We're doing podcasts continuously about extreme weather risk. We're going to be hitting this hurricane season really hard. We'll be doing podcasts as well from these disaster zones where the hurricanes hit this year.
Well, hopefully we'll have a chance to collaborate in the field as well. I need to stay on top of that. It would be interesting to have you help us set up equipment and be a part of that equation. Hal, thank you very much. It's a long time I've been wanting to do this. I'm glad we did it tonight. Thanks. Take care of yourself out there. Travel safe to and from the storms. That's the most dangerous part for us, I think. The storms we can see on radar, the jack wagons out there, you can't.
Thanks so much, Mark, for having me.
You betcha.